It is October 2nd, 1942, and the HMT Queen Mary is nearing the end of a voyage to Scotland. She was carrying thousands of American soldiers that were desperately needed in Europe to help out with the war effort. As she approached Ireland's coastline, a fleet of British ships began to head towards the Queen Mary to help escort her into port and to protect her from enemy U-boats. Most of the ships traveled a fair distance ahead of the Queen Mary. However, one ship, the HMS Curacoa, remained close by to travel alongside the Queen Mary, and, if necessary, she was there to help defend the Queen Mary from enemy aircraft. However, after some time went by, the crew on the Queen Mary's bridge noticed the Curacoa slowly but surely getting closer and closer to the ship. Eventually, the Curacoa got way too close, and at the last second, a crew member on the Queen Mary's bridge ordered the ship to turn hard to port, hoping to steer away from the Curacoa. However, it was too late. What was about to happen now couldn't be avoided, and it was about to claim over 300 lives. The Queen Mary, one of the most legendary ocean liners to ever exist. She first sailed on her maiden voyage on May 27, 1936, and for the next several years she would successfully transport thousands of people between Europe and the United States. However, all that would change on September 1, 1939, after World War II officially broke out in Europe. And even though it wasn't immediately apparent, due to the war, the fate of the Queen Mary was about to be changed forever. You see, after war broke out, the Allies were in desperate need of troop ships. Troop ships, as the name implies, are vessels that are used to transport soldiers to wherever they're needed to help out with the war effort. Now, this task doesn't have to be done exclusively by military vessels. Most ships can be used as troop ships once they've gone through a bit of a conversion process. Now, ultimately, it was decided to use the Queen Mary as a troop ship, and I can understand why. The Queen Mary was one of the largest, if not the largest ship around at the time, which means she could transport a lot more soldiers, per crossing over the Atlantic than other ships. And on top of that, she was also incredibly fast. She could reach speeds of roughly 32 knots or so, give or take, which means she was well suited to outrun enemy ships and U-boats that she may encounter when crossing the Atlantic. Now, when the Queen Mary went in for her conversion process, they painted the ship in all gray to help disguise the ship from being spotted by enemy U-boats and other ships, and they also took out a lot of her fine furnishings and other things that were inside the ship that made her an ocean liner and stripped her down to the basics so they could fit a lot more soldiers on board the Queen Mary per crossing over the Atlantic. Now, eventually, the Queen Mary would be given a new nickname during the war. She was given this nickname for several reasons, the first of which was her gray paint scheme, and the second reason was due to the ship's strange ability to be able to secretly travel to all parts of the world without being spotted by enemy ships or U-boats. The nickname that was given to the Queen Mary was the Gray Ghost. Now, by the time the war was over, the Queen Mary, or the Gray Ghost, would go on to transport somewhere around 810,000 troops. I want you guys to take a moment to let that number sink in. 810,000 troops. I mean, it's absolutely insane. Now, I did look into how many troops the Queen Mary would carry, per voyage across the Atlantic or to wherever she was going. And there were cases where the ship would have somewhere around 16,000 troops on board during one crossing. I mean, it's insane. I don't know if any of you have ever seen these photos of the Queen Mary during the war, but look at the ship's decks. You can see all of those men on board the Queen Mary, and it's literally shoulder to shoulder. I mean, there are so many men crammed on board the Queen Mary that they barely have room to move around without bumping into someone. I mean, it's insane. Now, the Queen Mary would go on to have a very long and successful war record. Not once did the Queen Mary ever find herself under enemy attack by anything. Aircraft, enemy ship, U-boats, whatever, nothing ever attacked the Queen Mary. However, despite this doesn't mean that the Queen Mary made it through the entire war without incident. In fact, there was one accident the Queen Mary was involved in that would ultimately claim around 300 lives. And it's the story of that horrible accident that we're about to discuss. The story of this disaster begins on October 2nd, 1942. At this time, the Queen Mary, or the Grey Ghost, is approaching the northern coast of Ireland. She is bound for Greenock, Scotland, where she will drop off thousands of American soldiers bound for Europe that are desperately needed to help out with the war effort. However, as the ship got closer to the United Kingdom, the threat of an attack by an enemy U-boat or aircraft increased. You see, what you have to understand is that Hitler and the Nazis were extremely determined to sink as many Allied ships as possible, especially the Queen Mary. The Nazis knew the critical role that the Queen Mary played for the Allies, so they were desperate to sink her. In fact, they were so desperate that Hitler put a $250,000 bounty on the Queen Mary to be awarded to whichever U-boat captain could sink her. Now, the Allies were aware at how desperately the Nazis wanted to sink the Queen Mary. So what they decided to do was have the Queen Mary rely primarily on her speed to avoid being attacked by enemy ships or U-boats. U-boats were the biggest risk to the Queen Mary whenever it was crossing the Atlantic. Now, as previously stated, the Queen Mary could travel at speeds of somewhere around 32 knots. But U-boats, they were nowhere near that fast. On the surface, U-boats could only travel at roughly 18 knots or so, give or take. And when they were submerged, they were even slower, only reaching speeds of somewhere around 7 or 8 knots. So, as long as the Queen Mary maintained her speed of 32 knots, a U-boat would have to be extremely lucky to even be able to take a shot at the Queen Mary. So this is why the Allies relied so much on the Queen Mary's speed. When the Queen Mary was crossing the Atlantic, the Allies told the ship's crew that under no circumstances were they to stop the Queen Mary. If they did, they would make the ship an easy target for enemy U-boats or ships or whatever was in the area. And it was this decision that would soon play a huge role in the disaster to come. Now, while speed was the primary defense for the Queen Mary, it wasn't the only defense system the ship had on board to protect itself against enemy attacks. While 32 knots is incredibly fast for a ship, it really wouldn't help out that much against enemy aircraft, which could easily catch up to the Queen Mary. So what the Allies did was they equipped the Queen Mary with a ton of anti-aircraft guns positioned all around the ship's bow, her boat deck, her stern, and so on and so forth. Now, even though the Queen Mary was fairly well equipped to deal with most threats that she would encounter when crossing the Atlantic, the British Admiralty wanted to take extra steps to ensure the ship's safety as she approached Scotland on this voyage. So what they decided to do was send a fleet of British warships to go and meet up with the Queen Mary as she began to approach the northern coast of Ireland. However, while all of these ships were en route to the Queen Mary, the weather took a turn for the worst. You see, the seas got a lot more choppy, the winds were picking up, and it was becoming more and more difficult for this fleet of warships to safely navigate the waters and get to the Queen Mary. So it was ultimately decided that all of the warships, with the exception of one, which was called the HMS Curacoa, would turn around and patrol the waters around an hour or so ahead of the Queen Mary, while the HMS Curacoa would be the Queen Mary's one and only direct escort that would sail alongside the Queen Mary until the ship safely arrived in port. Now, the HMS Curacoa was a light cruiser built for the Royal Navy during the final year of the First World War. She first entered service on February 18, 1918, and she performed very well during the final 9 months of the war. However, by the time World War II came around, the Curacoa was starting to show its age. Eventually, the British Admiralty decided to use the Curacoa as an anti-aircraft ship. She would basically sail alongside other Allied ships and provide anti-air defense just in case they got attacked by enemy aircraft, and she performed very well at this task. Now, even though the government did their best to keep the Curacoa, up to date with the times, there were some limitations that the ship had given her age that they simply could not fix. One of these issues was the ship's engines. You see, when the Curacoa first entered service, she could reach speeds of roughly 29 knots. However, age had taken its toll on the ship's engines, and by World War II, the vessel could only reach speeds of roughly 23 to 25 knots, somewhere around there. Now, while this doesn't seem like that big of a deal, it would soon have deadly consequences and a disaster to come. Now, it's important to note that when the Queen Mary was crossing the Atlantic, she wasn't following the same kind of route that she would normally do if she was sailing this crossing outside of wartime. You see, outside of wartime, most ships follow a straight course from wherever they're going to their final destination. However, during times of war, as a precaution against U-boat attacks, most ships would do what is called a zigzag course. What this means is, as the vessels cross the Atlantic, instead of just traveling straight, They zigzag, going back and forth as they're going to wherever their final destination may be. Now, during this particular crossing, this is how the Queen Mary zigzag worked. She would travel straight for 4 minutes, then make a slight turn to starboard and follow that course for 8 minutes, then make a slight turn to port and follow that course for 8 minutes, and then she would even out and travel straight for another 4 minutes. She would follow this course all the way from where she left port to her final destination. Now, once the Curacoa finally met up with the Queen Mary, it didn't take very long for the crew of the Curacoa to realize that they had a serious problem on their hands. You see, due to the maximum speed differences between the two ships, there was no way that the Curacoa was going to be able to keep up with the Queen Mary as it continued to sail across the Atlantic. Remember, the Queen Mary could travel at roughly 32 knots, while the Curacoa could only travel at 25. So what the crew of the Curacoa decided to do was use the Queen Mary's zigzag course to their advantage. Instead of trying to match up the Queen Mary's zigzag course and getting left behind, instead the Curacoa would simply travel a straight course alongside the Queen Mary while it continued to zigzag, and they hoped by doing this they would be able to maintain close proximity to the Queen Mary as it finished its voyage to Scotland. Now, the two ships would continue on this course for some time. However, at roughly 12:30 p.m., the captain of the Curacoa noticed the Queen Mary was beginning to pull away from his ship. So what he decided to do was order a course change that would allow the Curacoa to keep up with the Queen Mary. However, by ordering this course change, it would bring the Curacoa in dangerously close to the Queen Mary. Now, this course change was noticed by the Queen Mary's officer of the watch, who was on the bridge at the time, and it greatly worried him. So much so that he ordered the Queen Mary to turn to starboard in an effort to keep enough safe distance between the two ships. Now, this course change was noticed by the Queen Mary's captain, who was on the bridge at the time, and he asked the officer of the watch, "Why did you do this course change?" He explained the situation with the Curacoa and how it was becoming closer and closer to the Queen Mary, but the Queen Mary's captain told him not to worry. The Curacoa's crew was used to escorting and that they would stay out of the Queen Mary's way. Then he told the Queen Mary's helmsman to continue on their original course. You see, a big reason why the Queen Mary's captain didn't want to do this course change was by doing it, it would interrupt the Queen Mary's zigzag course that it had been doing since it started its voyage across the Atlantic. So with this order given, the Queen Mary's captain left the bridge. However, as more and more time went by, the Curacoa and the Queen Mary would slowly but surely keep sailing closer and closer to each other. Now, at this point, it seems like there was a communications breakdown between the Queen Mary and the Curacoa. Neither ship was doing a good job at informing the other ship what their ship was doing. And one particular reason why this is so bad is due to the Queen Mary's zigzag course. Remember, the Queen Mary is still zigzagging while the Curacoa is still sailing straight ahead. And with the ships being so close together, depending on where the Queen Mary is in her zigzag course, there could be an instance where the Queen Mary would turn into the Curacoa and overtake the ship. Now, according to the rules of the sea, whenever you have a situation where one ship is going to overtake another ship, the right of way is given to the ship that is going to overtake the other ship. Now, in the instance of the Queen Mary and the Curacoa, you had a case where both ship captains thought they were overtaking the other ship, and they expected the other ship to respond accordingly. And due to the communications breakdown between the two ships, when you have a situation where both captains think they're right, what's going to happen? Both ships are going to wait, thinking the other ship is going to respond, and this would soon have deadly consequences. It is now roughly 2 p.m., and the Queen Mary has just entered the part of her zigzag course where the vessel is now going to be traveling straight ahead. Now, at this time, the Curacoa was around 1,000 yards or so ahead of the Queen Mary and off to the Queen Mary's starboard side. Now, when the Queen Mary began her straight course, this now meant that the Queen Mary and the Curacoa, while the Curacoa is still ahead of the ship, were now traveling in roughly the same direction. Now, in just a couple of minutes, the Queen Mary was going to begin the starboard turn part of her zigzag course. And when she did this, it would now mean that the Queen Mary is sailing directly towards the Curacoa. Now, the officer of the watch on the Queen Mary that was previously concerned about how close the Curacoa was, well, right before this starboard turn was ordered, he was called off the bridge by the ship's captain and ordered to the chart room. That's where the captain was, and he wanted to discuss something with him. Now, this officer of the watch, He neglected to inform the new officer of the watch that was going to take over for him while he was gone how dangerously close the Curacoa really was. He legit had no idea. The old officer of the watch leaves, the new officer of the watch takes over and orders the turn to starboard. The Queen Mary is now sailing directly towards the Curacoa. The new officer of the watch would quickly realize the problem. However, by the time he did, it would already be too late. It is now 2:11 p.m. and the Queen Mary is rapidly approaching the HMS Curacoa. Very few people on board the Curacoa, if any at all, see the Queen Mary rapidly approaching. Meanwhile, on the Queen Mary's bridge, the officer of the watch finally sees that the Queen Mary is rapidly approaching the Curacoa. He quickly orders the ship to turn hard to port in an attempt to steer away from the Curacoa. However, it's already too late. I'll let you all see what happens next.
Getting close. Port a little. Yes, sir. Port! Hard to port! What's closer? Stop it! 15! Run the 15, I have.
Now, the Queen Mary struck the Curacoa somewhere along the middle of the ship. Right after impact, both the bow and stern sections of the Curacoa were completely separated from each other. The stern part of the Curacoa was pushed along the Queen Mary's starboard side, and it began to sink rapidly. Almost immediately following the impact, the Curacoa's stern section took on a very sharp list to starboard, and then a few moments later, she completely rolled over on her starboard side and began to slip beneath the surface. The last part of the Curacoa's stern section that anyone saw before she sank was the ship's port side propeller, which was still spinning as the Curacoa's stern section left the surface. Now, the bow section of the Curacoa was pushed along the Queen Mary's port side, and the force of the impact caused the bow section to swing completely around and face the opposite direction that she was traveling in pre-impact. Now, following the impact, the bow section of the Curacoa would begin to sink rapidly. However, she wouldn't sink as quickly as the Curacoa's stern section did, giving the crew that were on the bow section a few precious minutes to try to escape before the Curacoa sank out from underneath them. Now, it does seem like that in the moments leading up to the collision, the Curacoa's captain may have seen the Queen Mary rapidly approaching. He quickly gave the order to turn the Curacoa to starboard in an attempt to pull the ship away from the Queen Mary. However, this order came way too late, and a few moments later, the Queen Mary struck the Curacoa, throwing the captain and many of the bridge officers across the bridge. Once they got back to their feet, the captain first ordered the Curacoa's engines to be stopped, not realizing that his vessel had been completely separated in two and he no longer had any engines to speak of. Once he gave this order, he and many of the bridge officers left the bridge to go and assess the damage. But what they did not yet realize was that the Curacoa had just mere minutes left to live. Meanwhile, on the Queen Mary's boat deck, there was no mystery about what had just happened. At the time of the impact, there were thousands of men on the Queen Mary's decks watching this tragedy unfold. They witnessed nothing but pure chaos on the decks of the Curacoa. Men running around in all directions, doing everything they could to try to escape the rapidly sinking vessel. There was no time to begin prepping any of the Curacoa's lifeboats or order any kind of orderly evacuation. The only thing the men on the Curacoa could do at this time was throw on their life jackets and try to escape the Curacoa before they went down with the ship. Now, there was one particular soldier on the Queen Mary's boat deck. His name was Olin Medley, and he, just like all the other soldiers that were on the boat deck at the time, were watching this terrible disaster unfold. However, unlike everybody else, he happened to have a small pocketable camera with him. He quickly took out the camera and took a photo of the Curacoa sinking. The photo you are seeing on screen right now is the only known photograph of the Curacoa taken during the ship's final moments. And honestly, it really is nothing but a pure miracle that we have this photo. And the reason for that, you will find out later in the video. Now, it was at this point that the captain of the Queen Mary had a very important decision to make. Should he stop the Queen Mary and launch a rescue mission to try to save some of the survivors of the Curacoa, or should he keep the ship going on to Scotland? Well, while the answer to this question does seem to be pretty obvious, it's not what you would expect. Remember how earlier in this video we discussed that under no circumstances was the Queen Mary to stop while traveling across the Atlantic. This was an order directly to the captain from the Admiralty. Well, that order stands even in a situation like this. The captain of the Queen Mary could not stop the ship and attempt to rescue the survivors. If he did, it would make the Queen Mary an easy target for U-boats. So the captain did the only thing he could do. He kept the ship going, heading towards Scotland, and sent out a radio message to other ships in the area so they could launch their own rescue mission to try to save the survivors of the rapidly sinking Curacoa. Meanwhile, back on board the Curacoa, the vessel was sinking rapidly. She was sinking midship section first, and the more the midship part of the Curacoa went down, the more the Curacoa's bow rose up higher and higher into the air. The men that were still on board the Curacoa at this point could do nothing except simply jump overboard and try to swim away from the Curacoa. It really was dumb luck if any of these men happened to have a life jacket with them. There was no time to try to search the ship for life jackets. The vessel was just sinking way too quickly. Now, a few of the Curacoa's bridge officers did return to the bridge post-collision to try to collect as many sensitive and classified documents as they could. They wanted to properly dispose of these documents and not leave anything behind that an enemy could potentially find later if they were to investigate the shipwreck. Once the Curacoa's bridge officers left the bridge, they too jumped overboard and began to swim away from the ship. Then, a few minutes later, they heard a horrible sound directly behind them. They turned around and watched with great sadness as their once mighty ship, the HMS Curacoa, slowly sank before their eyes. Now, what you may have noticed in that animation you just watched, shortly before the Curacoa's bow slipped beneath the surface, there was some kind of explosion at the very front of the ship. Well, this explosion was caused by air that was trapped within the Curacoa's bow section during the ship's final moments. As the ship continued to sink deeper and deeper into the sea, the air that was within the bow section had nowhere to go, so it caused the air pressure to keep building up and building up, until finally, right before the ship slipped beneath the surface, the air exploded out through the weakest part of the Curacoa's structure it could find, and that was the Curacoa's decking. Once the air exploded out of the Curacoa, the ship dropped like a rock and quickly sank to the bottom of the sea, just 6 minutes following its collision with the Queen Mary. Now, at this point, all of the survivors of the Curacoa are now swimming for their lives in the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, they did not have time to launch any of the Curacoa's lifeboats before the sinking, so they all went down with the ship. The survivors expected the Queen Mary to stop and turn around to come back and rescue them. However, as they watched the ship, they saw, to their horror, that the Queen Mary had no intention. The ship was continuing on its original heading. So at this point, the survivors could do nothing except try to hang on for as long as they could and hope that rescue would come for them before they all eventually lost their lives in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, it only took the Queen Mary's captain a few minutes to send word to the Admiralty about the disaster that fell upon his ship and the HMS Curacoa, and the Admiralty was quick to respond. They sent ships to the area where the Curacoa sank as quickly as they could. However, it would take them around 2 hours to reach the scene. Right after the Queen Mary's captain sent word to the Admiralty, he had another matter that required his urgent attention. You see, the Queen Mary did not survive the collision with the Curacoa undamaged. The very front of the Queen Mary, otherwise known as the prow, suffered heavy damage in the collision, and water was rapidly flooding into the forwardmost compartment of the Queen Mary. Now, thanks to the Queen Mary's watertight compartments, they were able to bring the flooding under control. but the captain was forced to slow the Queen Mary down from its top speed of roughly 32 knots to only 10 knots. She would be forced to continue at this speed until she would eventually be repaired. Now, around 2 hours following the sinking of the HMS Curacoa, other ships would arrive in the area and begin searching for survivors. Once they found them, they brought aboard as many as they could. But, to their horror, they discovered that out of 438 men that were on board the Curacoa at the time of her sinking, only 101 men were able to survive this horrible disaster, the captain of the HMS Curacoa being among the survivors. Now, everyone that had witnessed this horrible disaster was sworn to secrecy. The Allies did not want the Nazis to find out what had happened between the Curacoa and the Queen Mary. This is why it's a miracle that we have that photo showing the Curacoa sinking. If the Allies had discovered that photo, they would have destroyed it really quick. Now, around 2 days after the disaster, an inquiry was held to figure out what had just happened and whose fault it was that the Queen Mary struck the Curacoa. And ultimately, they ruled that fault laid with the Queen Mary. They said that it was the Queen Mary's fault for steering into the Curacoa. But they also said that the Curacoa was at fault for not taking into account the dangerous situation they were in and anticipating what the Queen Mary was going to do. Cunard White Star strongly disagreed with this decision. However, it wouldn't be until after the war that they would be able to launch a more thorough investigation into the horrible disaster that was the Queen Mary collision with the Curacoa. Now, following the war, the story of the Queen Mary Curacoa collision would become public knowledge at last. Eventually, the case would go to trial once again, so they could try to figure out once and for all whose fault it was that this horrible disaster took place. Eventually, the case would reach the highest court in the UK at the time, the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords would listen to the testimony of both of the ship's captains, as well as go through all the ship's logs to figure out exactly all the chain of events that occurred that led up to the collision between the Queen Mary and the Curacoa. And eventually, they ruled that both ships were guilty of some negligence. Here is some of their findings. Both ships failed to take appropriate action when danger arose. Communication between the officers of the watch on the Queen Mary is deemed unsatisfactory. The Curacoa was also criticized for not doing its duty to give way to the Queen Mary, which was a much larger ship and as such much less maneuverable. Eventually, the court said that 1/3 of the blame goes to the Queen Mary and 2/3 of the blame goes to the Curacoa. Now, the Admiralty strongly disagreed with this decision. However, their ruling was upheld. And with that, guys, now all of you know the story of the collision between the Queen Mary and the HMS Curacoa. Guys, this video was a ton of work, so if you enjoyed it, please be sure to leave this video a like, and if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much, it really helps out a lot. Oh, and guys, if you would like to join the Historic Travels Discord server, where we just hang out and discuss famous shipwrecks from history and talk about a bunch of other random stuff, I will include a link to that in the description below. I hope you join us. Oh, and we also have a Historic Travels Minecraft server where we do similar stuff that we do on the Discord server, but we're playing Minecraft. I hope to see you guys there. All right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Y'all take care. Huge thank you to Space Killer 555 and Not Your Voice for animating and bringing the Queen Mary and the HMS Curacoa back to life. This video would not have been possible without you guys. Thanks so much. Special thanks to my Captain Level Patreon supporters, John and Tammy Lee. Thank you all so much for all the support.